times facing nations requires another way of thinking as we approach what many are now calling a new normal. So this idea of this webinar transpired because there is a need particularly to galvanize and to bring together those who can shed some light on what really is going on, particularly in terms of jobs. And the hope is that out of this webinar, there are parliamentarians who are attending this webinar, and we are also broadcasting through Facebook. And the hope is that we will be able to bring many of the issues raised, as well as some of the discussions that transpires throughout this webinar to Parliament, as well as to the broader public. So today we have brought together a number of esteemed speakers. Of course, Datuk Sri Anwar Ibrahim, Member of Parliament for Port Dickson, as well as the leader of, or the president of Parti Kalangan Rakyat, as well as Pakatan Harapan. We have Tan Ihan from REFSA. We have Hafiz Nur Shams, an independent economist, as well as Dr. Nungsari Ahmad Radi, who I'm sure many of us would have read has been in the news recently. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to invite Datuk Sri Anwar Ibrahim to give his opening remarks. Datuk Sri, dipersilakan.
Assalamualaikum, salam sejahtera. Thank you, Fahmi and the panelists. I must begin by saying that today is the day we should celebrate Workers' Day. But of course, given the circumstances at present, it's quite a gloomy period for workers. There's massive retrenchment and massive unemployment as a result. We have inherited some of the traditionally not a very promising system for the workers, complaining about low wages, not consistent productivity, the lack of labor rights in the past decades, where legislation has been introduced not in the interest of unions, etc. And we also have a major problem of heavy dependence on migrant workers. Most of them, or some of them at least, are registered, some are considered illegal. And as a result, there is also a growing problem of unemployment and youth underemployment. The panelists, of course, is meant to advise not only the general public, but also the parliamentarians, although we have, again, to face this problem of parliamentary session, which is not going to happen. What is being suggested by the government is only the opening address by the Agong and followed by the introduction of some bills. But nonetheless, I think it is incumbent that parliamentarians are aware of their task and duty and will demand a proper sitting so that these issues can be raised. And there are essentially 4 stages that we need to deal with, and I'm sure we can expect to hear more from the panelists directly or somewhat involved either in the research and the practical work. But it is contingent upon our understanding of the economic data, which sometimes is questionable, the projections and then policy solutions, find and allocate budget for this purpose and implement policy, and at the same time gather feedback. We have, for example, this issue about U-turn and inconsistent statements by leaders. And yesterday, netizens became very angry as a result of Bank Negara announcement imposing a renege on their commitment on the interest. And what's shocking to me, even talking about interest affecting Islamic banks. And this would require another clarification from the Prime Minister, I suppose, other than the Bank Negara. Now, we have, of course, I would not proceed with reading the statistics about workers and the labor force and PMET as compared to semi-skilled and low-skilled workers, which is quite prominent, notwithstanding Malaysia is a trading nation, industrial country, but still we have about 59% low-skilled, semi-skilled, and 13.4% low-skilled workers. At the same time, then we see the major concern disconcerting figures and statistics. Monthly household gross income by occupation. To suggest that there's something flawed in the system. And this has been somewhat used to a large extent, instead of talking about real measures to combat this problem in terms of training, in terms of digitalization, in terms of new avenues in the services sector, in the ITs, and digitalization in particular. It has brought about a contentious debate on based on the race divide. That's why the Pakatan system, and not in the last few months giving any sort of policy direction that this is going to change. So I think there are, again, major issues affecting the future of workers and the new avenues, given the new scenario. They say new normal. Everybody talks about new normal, but not practical action and understanding what it involves and what new initiatives should be taken up now to ensure that there is an improvement or clear direction where the country would go. So I think I would end at that to allow for discussions, because we have some very prominent panelists who could not only give a better understanding but also educate our parliamentarians. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sri Anwar. I think those are important way of framing this discussion. Of course, if we look at the news over the last couple of days, some of the hardest hit sectors includes hotels, as well as a number of industries like publishing, as well as advertising. The news about the shuttering of operations of some major advertising agencies in Malaysia, I think is quite shocking to many, because the presence also indicates a gloomy outlook for the economy going forward. So now I'd like to invite Saudara Hafiz Nur Shams, who we used to see in Parliament, and before that, a long while ago, always reading his comments on Twitter. So today we will be able to hear his presentation, and I surrender the floor to Saudara Hafiz.
Right. Thank you for having me. Let me switch on the slide first. Do you see the slide?
Yes.
All right, great. All right, thank you. So I want to show, that's also for the presentation, for the practice of presentation, I have 3 segments. First is to set the general outlook for the economy and what it means. Second, to describe what's happening in the labor market. And third, possibly to provide some framework how to respond to all the issues at hand. So to start with, we know Bank Negara is forecasting the 2020 economy to grow between 0.5% or contracting at worst 2%. And at the same time, they also expect the unemployment rate to hit 4% in 2020. So you could see in 1998, which the worst crisis Malaysia ever had, the GDP went down by 4% actually. And Bank Negara projection is 2%. And Bank Negara projection came about in late March, I'm mistaken. So that hasn't quite taken into account the extension of the lockdown, which has gone for 6 weeks. And that might change the projection. So I believe it might actually be worse. That similarly would be for the unemployment rate. So at 4%, compared to currently about 3.3, 3.2, 3.4, that means about 100 and 150 more people being unemployed, additional people being unemployed. But the problem with forecasts for this year and next year is that there's a lot of uncertainty. You can see IMF forecasts Malaysia to contract by 1.7%, right? But unfortunately, what is not being discussed widely is how uncertain the forecast is. So you could see in the chart, there's a red box showing to distribution, right? The distribution we are interested in, this is global growth. There's IMF talking about global growth. There's the red line. It's a very fat red line, a short. So IMF expect the world economy to contract by 3%, which is the top of the curve. But what is important is the distribution of the curve. So that shows how uncertain they are. This compared to last year when they forecasted the economy to grow about 3.2%, positive 3.2%, 3.1%. You can see the green curve is much higher. The higher it is, the more certain a forecast is. So the point I want to show in this chart is that with point forecast, there's a lot of uncertainty. So there's danger that the economy might do worse. I think there's a real danger that it might do worse than Bank Negara projection or even IMF projection. So if you're interested in reading more of this, there's something called the Global Financial Stability Report by IMF, released in early April. It's on page 15. So because of the uncertainty, we have to remember what happened in the past. In the past, for instance, a lot of people have been talking about V-shaped recovery, right? It happened before. But in Malaysia, for instance, in 1998, it took Malaysia about 1 year to get back to pre-crisis level of output level, right? For Indonesia, it took 4 years. For Greece, during the debt crisis, they have never actually recovered. So this is the thing we have to remember when we talk about recovery, about V-shape and stuff. V-shape is not a guarantee, especially in this crisis. It's a special crisis. Previous crisis was always mostly demand-side crisis. But this time around, it's a supply-side crisis. It means your potential is under pressure. And if you lose that potential, it might take a long time to recover the potential. It's not as easy to pump up the economy with demand when your potential is not there. So talking about V-shaped recovery, right? From this chart, from Malaysia, you can see on the left chart, you can see Malaysia took about 1 year to go back to pre-crisis level. But in the bigger picture, you can see this is Malaysia index GDP over about 30 years, right? You can see there's some kind of lost potential for Malaysia from 1957. So in the recession in 2008 was very shallow. So you can see like, not so much potential loss, not so much output loss, and then recovery can quite quickly, and then the trend seems to be the same. But if compared to the 1990s, there's a real loss in trends. The loss, if you draw, it's not very scientific, but that's the main idea. If you draw a line that compares the 1990s compared to the rest of the growth, you can see actual growth is lower compared to that trend. So that means crisis, especially big crisis, can leave a scar on the economy for a very long time. So if you think about it, the structure of the Malaysian economy also is a vestiges of the 1990s. The GLCs happened because of the bailout, and there's a scar. Essentially, the point is there's a scar. So what I'm trying to say is that don't be bought by V-shaped recovery narrative. If you bought it, you might underestimate the severity of the crisis. And if you underestimate it, the policy response might be inadequate. And that can bring real long-term cost to the economy. That's the message that I think I want to deliver. So moving on, let's go on to the next section. So what's happening in the labor market? So we don't have much data yet, except for anecdotes. We hear in the news all this layout, and then the Department of Statistics produced an early survey of what happened in the labor market. This survey is not representative because of the difficulties in running surveys in this kind of situation. But if you look at it in service sector, which about 60% of the nation economy, or 50%, I can't remember. Based on the survey, about 50% lost their jobs. In manufacturing, industrial, about 6 or 7%, agriculture about 21%. But I think I want to bring attention to manufacturing sector per se, subsector, because manufacturing employs about a third, or slightly above a third. Manufacturing and retail employ about a third, slightly above a third of Malaysian employers. You can see that 4.2% lost a job. In the retail, it's much worse, 50%. But when you lose a job, you also have to think about unpaid leave, right? You could see, if you take it, look at this chart, a lot of people are being put into unpaid leave. So that means they lost income. So essentially unemployed. Technically, they're not unemployed, but essentially are unemployed. So if this survey were representative, right, which is not, but if it were, this would suggest that employment rate is about 13%. If you think about it, 13% compared to the normal rate of 3.3%, and Negara projection of 4% for this year. If 4% versus 3.3%, Negara projection, that's about 150,000 people unemployed. If 13%, that means additionally about 1.5 million people unemployed. That's a huge number. So this is how we have to be mindful. We have to be mindful that this is not representative, but you also have to be mindful of the risks that we face in terms of labor market. And when we think about that, then we think about people that might be hit the most. Everybody will be hit, but some people will be hit the most. Like youth, for instance. Youth generally have little experience. So when situation become worse and employees have to make decision, they probably would have to shed those with least experience that can be dispensed of. And that's unfortunately, that would be youth. And then also fresh grads, they will be looking for jobs, but in a very bad labor market, where are they going to get the jobs? So they're going to be unemployed longer. And when they be unemployed longer, that means that their productive capacity is being wasted for doing nothing. They have to be more creative in being, doing their own business or do whatever they want to. And then finally, there's the low-skilled workers. Because usually in the past, people talk a lot about automation, but it never happened because automation is really expensive. The government gives out incentive, but people don't take it up. Very few people take it up. It is a grant fee scheme, a take-up rate probably 10%, 20%. And during crisis, especially when supply-side crisis, when there's no workers, these companies may finally be forced to automate their processes. When you automate your processes, demand for labor would come down in the short term. They might go up in the future for other purposes, other sectors that may require more skills, but in the short term, there's danger of that happening. In fact, there's also anecdotes of that happening already. And then there are also other people that we think about. Migrant workers, what's going to happen to them? This is important, right? Usually we think about Malaysia, but migrant workers are also important. But if you repatriate them, what's going to happen to the neighboring economy? Because neighboring economy, the performance of the neighboring economy would affect our economy as well. Just a simple example, when Singapore had the policy of lockdown, right? Suddenly there's a lot of unemployed Malaysians in Johor having jobs. That's a real issue. So this also have to be thought about. So going back to youth and fresh grad, I want to bring you to the chart to the left. So this is under normal times. This is what it looks like, the profile of the labor market. The youth have much higher unemployment rate. Those who just got off of university, fresh grads, or even the unemployment is about 9%. Those that have some experience, unemployment is closer to 4%. The rest of the people is less than 2%, right? So under crisis, this number will look much, much worse. Everything would go up, but the groups that are gonna face the brunt is really the under 30s, the youth. And then this is dangerous in many ways. It's not just the economy, it's also about social stability. If you have youth that are employed at much worse level, I will be scared to think about the implication of social stability, especially if you think about other countries that have gone through it. So looking forward, what's going to happen if there were going to be recovery? I think given the role of technology these days, there is a high risk of we experiencing a jobless recovery if there's going to be a recovery anytime soon. First of all, automation, digitalization, if you do this, like think about factories, right? Suddenly if you automate simple factories, the factories would require less people, just a simple logic. And then some industries may collapse. Fahmi talked about advertisement just now. It may take some time for them to be reabsorbed into labor market. A new advertising company wouldn't pop up next week just because. And then they also search costs for these unemployed workers. Where are they gonna go? They cannot, the economy is just so bad. And then, I mean, there's some, I mentioned on the red box earlier about some good news. Some good news is that the Malaysian economy may finally be forced to be more productive in the sense that become less labor intensive. Our economy has been labor intensive for a long time. Effort to make it less labor intensive hasn't been successful that much. This may force Malaysia to move up the labor chain. But the thing is, this all is cost. The cost is massive unemployment. Are we ready to face that social cost? I think Malaysia doesn't have that social capital to go through this issue. So I don't think we have to sum up for that, but we'll see. I think another concern is wage growth, right? When we come massive unemployment, especially in the supply side crisis, suddenly employers will have more bargaining power, and that means wages in the future, especially for youth, right? Not going to be that great, just because of the balance in the bargaining power. And then because of crisis, government may, because we already loosened some labor laws, right? Government is allowing for workers and employees to renegotiate for lower wages. When the crisis happened, are we sure that loosening gonna be repaired? Because the priority might be different. Priority might be job creation. When you want to create jobs, you want to have flexibility in the labor market. But if you have that flexibility, you create jobs, but wages might take a hit. So these are things that we have to talk about: greater competition for jobs, few openings, bargaining power, labor laws, and the emergence of more casual work, which is already happening in the past, but might see more. And I think the final part, what I'm going to go through is going through the framework of what policy would look like in various stages. So essentially, there are 3 stages. Right? First, of lockdown stages, where ideally we should be protecting jobs, protecting our capacity, and ensuring minimum welfare. In concrete terms, precisely productive in practical terms, meaning having a very big wage subsidies, which we haven't been doing. Our wage subsidies have been not that great. And also ensuring minimum welfare, meaning you have to do some kind of universal basic income during this lockdown period, because people cannot go out. So when people can't go out, they cannot work. So something has to replace that income. And that means universal basic income to some level. And we have to protect jobs to protect potential, because once the jobs are lost, it may take a long time to recover. So when it comes to recovery, when you don't have the jobs, it is much harder to boost the economy later. And then that's a lockdown period when we do all this band aid stuff. When we come to jump-starting the economy, that's why you actually boost the economy. You cannot boost the economy during lockdown because there's no demand. There's a supply constraint. But during a lockdown period, that's where you repair your potential and then you boost your demand. Then the post-election period, that's a more interesting part. Is there such thing as business as usual, or is this a new normal? We just don't know. A lot of people don't know. There's a lot more discussion to be had for post-election period, right? So this is what I think about when I think about a policy framework. We have to think about the scenarios, right? There's a worst case scenario, which a lot of people are talking about, comparing it to the 1930s, which was a long and deep recession. And then the base case scenario is 1990s recession. That's quite bad, but it was quick. And a lot of people also seem to believe in a V-shaped scenario, which was what a V-shaped recovery, which was the 2009 crisis. Wasn't that bad. But for me personally, I think I'll be gravitate towards worst case scenario, because this is the last time we had a supply side crisis was really in the 1940s, during the war, which was a long time ago, and then during the post-war period, during 1945, 1946, when the British administrator was trying to rebuild their potential. All the plants, the plantation, the stores had to be rebuilt, and those are the kind of supply side crisis. The supply side crisis isn't as bad as the Second World War, but we have to be mindful. The last time that happened was the Second World War. The recession in 2009, 1908, 85, 70-something, those are all demand side crises. We cannot take those crises as an example, as a leeway, as a example, right? Or the model that how we're going to respond to this kind of crisis. You have to go back to all the way to 1940s. Unfortunately, in that case, we might not need economists, we need historians. So I've shown you the graph. So this is basically repeating what I had before. So I hope we can discuss more further after this. And with that, I think I'll take my leave for the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Hafiz. I think this is very insightful, and a lot of questions are coming in. So for all of the attendees, just a reminder that you can put in your Q&A or your questions in the Q&A section, not really in the chat section, so that we can compile. I can't promise you that we will go through all of the questions, but we will try to go through as many as we can. There's also a request for these presentations to be made public. We will discuss with the presenters whether they can be, and how we can get them sent to the attendees later. So now I'd like to invite Ihan from REFSA. You have approximately 8 to 10 minutes.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'll try to keep it short. Let me just pull up my slides. Hold on. Okay, so thank you very much again, YB. Good morning, everyone. I would like to first of all thank IDE for inviting me to join this webinar. I think given the current COVID-19 pandemic and the economic crisis that we are in, and the whole world is in, I think it's very important for us to talk about this and to put jobs, especially jobs creation, back at the center of our economic policy making. I will try to focus a lot more about a framework of how we should think about creating good and better jobs, and we can go through some of the discussion points. A second. So I think by now we are all aware that as we emerge from the current COVID-19 crisis, as Hafiz mentioned, life will not be the same again. So if I may, I will just share some thoughts on the current situation as we are, the market shocks, the stimulus package that we have been given, the long-term and short-term effects and impact coming out from the crisis, and last but not least, some of the policy responses to address our structural weaknesses and how we can in fact build better resiliency. Now, before I go into Malaysia, I just want to sort of bring up these slides to highlight the current situation and how unprecedented we are in terms of labor market. So as of yesterday, New York Times also announced that there are more than 30 million unemployed people in the US, and given that there's only 330 million population in the US, the report also states that that's almost soar past 20.6% if you look, and this number is in 23rd of April. So we're actually looking at very, very scary times. If you look at this first chart on the left-hand side, what is amazing about this top chart is that the unemployment insurance claims in the US is so high since the COVID-19 pandemic breakout that it is almost as vertical as the y-axis. So if you look at the timeline, we are looking at close all the way back to 1967. And here is a little bump of 2008, where we come on the global financial crisis. So I think it just gives you a sense of urgency on why we should look into this and talk about this. The lower chart here just shows from January this year, and you can see the really good, really big spike. So the magnitude of the job losses is huge. I think that's without a doubt. And clearly, as Hafiz mentioned, what I also want to point out is that these figures, unemployment figures and GDP growth, they are actually lagging indicators, which means that in short, we know it is bad. We know we're in a bad position, but we don't know how bad it is. We don't even know how bad it is as we stand now. We can see how bad it is last week and the week before, but we don't know how bad it is now and how bad it will be in the future. So the risk here is that because transactions are not happening and nobody is producing, so this translates to people losing jobs as companies cannot pay and close down, as we are starting to see. So the risk is that even when MCO is lifted or relaxed, the consumption level will drop because people just don't have the money to spend and the economy doesn't grow. So this is what I mean by the supply shock tipping into a demand side shock, and that will just prolong the whole recession. Now, going into Malaysia, I just want to quickly touch on the stimulus package. On the left-hand side is just another chart that one of our panelists shared in our REFSA webinar discussed earlier this month. It shows the workers badly hit by the MCO by sector. So you can see a lot of the sectors are not excluded. Some worse hit than others, and it's quite straightforward. We know which sectors they are. Now, how did our stimulus package go? I think the government did well in terms of providing the right direction by mitigating the short-term effects. So we put in the wage subsidy, we have the support for loans and all this sort of thing. But having said that, we are also a little bit lacking because it puts a large cost onto the banks and the financial sector. So the potential risk is that this may also go back into the financial crisis if banks are being given a lot of power in terms of holding the situation. Now, at the same time, the wage support is only partial and limited in time for Malaysia compared to, say, Singapore. Malaysia is given, say, 3 months starting from April. Singapore at the moment is you can get, for companies, you can get up to 9 months. And of course, relating to the strictness of the movement control measure, the next slide is a little bit outdated because this was prepared in 7th of April 2020. But REFSA did this chart to sort of showcase the stringency index measuring overall how each country is reacting in terms of stimulus package compared to the social distancing measures that they were implementing. So Singapore back in April was obviously considered an outlier because their measures were not as strict. Clearly now they are, but they were giving very, very strong sort of stimulus package. Malaysia is at the bottom here. We have very strict social distancing measures, and our stimulus package is considerably lower than Singapore, than France, than UK, and so forth. So there's almost, in a way, assumption that the stimulus package should be greater in size in those countries where the measures are stricter. I only have 3 slides left, so I will just run through it. What are the long-term effects that we are looking in terms of jobs? So I want to talk a bit more about the long-term effects and what we are looking at in 5 years, 10 years time. Because if we don't start thinking about it now and plan for it, we are just, basically putting out fire with water and constantly firefighting. And as Hafiz says, looking at band-aid solutions. So the long-term effect is very simple. This sort of economic crisis has historically shown a very asymmetric impact on workers and jobs. So white-collar workers, we are mostly able to work from home, you maintain your income, you still have Netflix, internet is good, things are manageable. But at the same time, for the blue-collar workers, so factories are shut, you are being told to take unpaid leaves, and you are hit quite hard on this, and your incomes become affected. Now, women, I want to mention about women as well. Women are particularly hard hit because at the same time, you need to manage household and childcare, not to say homeschooling duties as well. But a lot of women, especially young women, are also taking up informal jobs so that they can manage their family life as well. Now, these jobs are become very, very, especially uncertain now. So in fact, a World Bank's report has published last year stated that the country's per capita income could grow by 26% if all barriers to women workers were removed. And now we are talking about normal times, pre-COVID-19 scenarios. Now, of course, gig workers will suffer massive drop in revenue, and they do not benefit from social safety network. Talking about gig workers, I want to touch a little bit on the tourism industry as well. So there are also a lot of workers that are seasonal. Their jobs are very dependent on seasonal, and they may have short-term contracts. So freelance workers as well. These are the workers that are also particularly being hit hard at the current moment. Last but not least, I want to talk a little bit about informal workers. What I mean by this is, these are the guys that we know they are there, but we don't know where they are. So they don't pay taxes because they get paid in cash, and employers also do not declare that they pay these people, so they don't get EPF. There's no social protection as well. And these are the jobs that are often poor quality jobs, where the work is unstable and insecure, with limited labor and social protection. Now, I think all these factors will create a very heightened feeling of economic insecurity, which, truth be told, I think that it has been brewing increasingly for the last 10 years since the financial crisis. Jobs have become increasingly what's the word? It's very unstable, that you may lose it at any time. And especially now with the current situation, you could easily tip from an M40 into a B40 group just the very next day by losing your job. So for the last two slides, I want to sort of bring a bit of framework into some of the policy response that perhaps we should start thinking about. I base it on the concept of build back better. I think we are at a stage where business is as usual is gone. With the economic situation, coupled with the new social distancing measures and the necessity for people to change their behavior, how they live, how they work, how they play going forward, I think we have to ask ourselves how to build back a better and more resilient economy, while ensuring that people can live a decent living with good job and good pays. So I want to run through these four points. And I want to touch specifically on the role of the government in creating jobs. And there is a gap here that the government could try and kickstart. So the first thing, I think, first and foremost, jobs with good pay, with high pay, will obviously lessen the economic insecurity felt by the workers. Now, how can we create higher paying jobs? I think in simple terms, it's correlated to higher productivity. So we talked a little bit earlier, Hafiz mentioned about automation and training and all that. I think you need to increase productivity. That means you need to require investment in providing better tools and things like that. But the question is, with the current environment, is it feasible to expect private companies, private firms to do that in the current environment? Most probably, it will be very difficult. So one way to do that is to perhaps leverage on the concept of missions for the government to kickstart investment based on mission-oriented sort of investments that targeted towards societal goals. So this was first introduced by the economist, Professor Mariana Mazzucato, where she explains that when government use mission-oriented sort of a mindset to solve problems, you can be engineer of innovation. So for example, hard disks and microprocessors and memory chips, as she quoted in her book, they were all funded by the US Department of Defense to solve the problem of satellite communication. But clearly, these products will later on flow into the commercial private sector and mainstream with massive leaps in public usage and public benefit, culminating in our iPhones and things like that. So I think such massive amount of investment can only be done cannot be done by the private sector due to the risk and the uncertainties of failing. So let's say as a government, you target a few things you want to realize as a society. So now we are facing COVID-19, we are facing climate change. So you invest in these industries, you kickstart initiatives, you fund them and have private companies participate in them and get paid for. So that would potentially have a trickle down effect of creating jobs in these growth sectors. So what we are looking at is creating good jobs that are sustainable. And so to that effect, for example, in Malaysia, you can look at investing in vaccine, you can look at investing in care industry, investing and paying our nurses better and see how we can make their job more productive and our public benefit can benefit from it. And we can also encourage Malaysia to move towards renewable energy. We develop less resource intensive farming methods, public transports, invest in R&D and innovation and things like that. So that brings me to the next point where we try to build a more resilient national economy. It is very clear that by now, I think the COVID-19 crisis laid the risks of the interdependency on the global supply chain. So we can see that we are very susceptible to factors completely outside our control, but affects us tremendously, like when China goes into lockdown and the parts produced in China are halted, you can't export your products to them and so on and so forth. I think at least we should be aware of that and try to manage that and create better policies that protect and build sectors that we think we need from a national perspective. So we should perhaps encourage a more localized economy and we start thinking about how to enhance our local supply chain and be more self-sufficient in things like food, masks, creation, PPE, medical equipments like ventilators. How can we create internally within our own country? So Hafiz slides talked about the collapse industry, like tourism. So I think we should ask ourselves, what are the sectors that we want to push at this moment? And if the government can come up with a game plan and we try to elevate these sectors and promote these sectors. So they should be things that could generate higher return, higher productivity, and better good for the society. And if we can do this together with a sort of mission-based sort of mindset, we can perhaps contribute to creating a higher pay and more relevant job that keeps the economy going. And last, very not least, I want to go to the last slide that I have. We talk a little bit more about the workers themselves as the challenges that they are facing now. So clearly for our workers, the objective is to ensure more stable income. And especially I want to talk about the workers in the gig economy, because again, World Bank mentioned that the gig economy made up 26% of Malaysia's total economic growth. So we should definitely not ignore these jobs. Perhaps giving them legal statute so that they don't fall between the cracks as we are seeing it now. In our stimulus package now, they are only offered a one-off 600 ringgit for taxi and Grab drivers. Should they be included in the employer retention program run by SOCSO? We should give them clarity where they are in our economy. I think that's key because then they can benefit from the social security and also at the same time pay the taxes and broaden our taxes as well. And of course, you know, this is an extra channel to help them in difficult times such as now when we are giving out wage subsidies. The other thing, the other point I want to mention is about the large informal sector. So this is a hidden pool because again, like I say, we know they are there. They are doing a lot of work, but we don't know who they are and where they stand. So when a crisis like this hits and jobs are lost, they don't only lose income, they cannot get government support as well. So essentially they're invisible in the job market. So perhaps we can consider a one-off regularization where we say we register them and we assist them in times like this, but they pay tax and then it broadens our tax base as well. And in that sense, they contribute to the economy and they are also recognized. So I think if we start thinking and pursuing some of this sort of approach and mindset, we can then pursue an economic policy that moves away from relying on low-wage workers that compete with other countries. And we can change our model slightly differently. I think if I may summarize it, I think government policy have a big role to play in determining what kind of jobs can be created. Because I think creating good jobs mean investing in creation or facilitation of industries that are likely to create those jobs. So I will just stop here. Thank you very much for giving me the time to share some of my views on this. And I'll pass it back to YB Fahmi.
Thank you. Thank you, Ihan. For all the panelists, just take note that we have a Q&A section and that there are questions there. So for those of you panelists who are inclined, you actually answer some of the questions that have been raised individually. Yeah, I think some of them might be pertinent to your presentations. Now I'd like to invite Dr. Nungsari to weigh in and give some thoughts and input to not only what has been presented before. We've seen what Hafiz and Ihan presented, but also perhaps to shed some light from your vantage point, from where you stand, about where things are going, particularly in relation to jobs, but also I think more broadly the economy. And so we hope to hear from you. Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you, Fahmi. Thank you for having me. The topic is so broad. I probably just restrict myself to three broad points, perhaps starting at the slightly high elevated perspective on trying to understand, give some light in terms of what is the nature of this particular crisis, and then I'll probably come down a bit on the second point on the labour market itself and trying to explain the challenges there, and the third point I'll probably take a shot at what the new normal is. So on the nature of the crisis, I think we need to understand that actually a lot of the things, especially those that has been affecting the labour market, the dynamics of that has already started happening before the COVID crisis. This whole disruption, adoption of technology and displacement of labour, disparity in wages, inequalities, and the resulting inequalities in society, and the kinds of political turmoil that you see all over the world has already started to been happening for the last, say, 20 years. So the inequalities especially. So you've already seen those things. Now this COVID-19 episode merely it did two things. It accelerated. It probably will result in the acceleration of the adoption of technology, and secondly, it will reveal in places where it's not been revealed the disparities and the inequalities that is already pervasive outside. This virus is a good guy in the sense that it doesn't discriminate who it wants to infect, but it is a quite discriminating virus in the sense of who it. If it gets to you or to me, the virus doesn't care, right? It will try to infect you and try to infect me. But the problem is, the virus is also an illustrator of the inequalities in society. For example, although it's indiscriminate in who it infects, it doesn't care where and how. But the people who are most exposed to it in the health sense are people who are poor, people who have no choice. People have to be in the front lines. People have to make sure that things are the essential services, except for the people who are in the hospitals. And so the inequality is also being illustrated and revealed by this virus, by this episode, and the economic consequences. It's even more pronounced that the economic consequences of this thing is going to be felt more by certain groups and less by other groups. So it's actually the inequality that you've seen before will be made more stark, more onerous by these circumstances. Now, it will be. This thing is unprecedented. It will be deep. I think Hafiz showed some of these slides, and Ihan showed those two. It will be deep and it will be quite long. See, what has happened is basically the ubat, the remedy for this thing is actually this MCO stuff, and basically it kills this is like having cancer, and then the best prescription is to do chemotherapy, because the chemotherapy will kill you too. If the cancer doesn't kill you, the chemotherapy will kill you, but you have no choice. So basically, global supply chains are totally disrupted. So and this is another thing. This is global and it's globally disrupted. So basically, there was a loss of confidence that resulted in asset prices going down like crazy. I mean, financial assets and physical asset prices have gone down because of the lockdown. Income has also been lost. So you have both a balance sheet kind of effect, which is actually wealth has gone down by substantial amount, and income, which is more of a flow, P&L kind of item, has also come down. So this is pervasive. It affects it affects people with money, with wealth. It also affect people with income. So immediately you're going to see consumption just going down the toilet actually on this one, and investments are not going to happen. So we know from very basic economics, aggregate demand is consumption, investment, plus government spending, plus what you get from net exports. So you're not going to get much from net exports. You're not going to get a lot from consumption. You're not going to get any investment until there's some clarity on this thing. And so you basically left with what government can do. So that's why government under this period cannot look at this in the fiscal sense. So I don't even like the word stimulus. Once you use the word stimulus, it has this connotation that you're going to stimulate the economy the way you want to stimulate, you lost 0.5%, you want to make up for the 0.5% in the Keynesian sense. This is not a stimulus. What government needs to do is actually, first and foremost, is actually to provide the safety net to make sure that people are alive. People just can get on with it, and then to wait for the next one. So actually, that's why I would think, I think in the short term, if the MCO was just 2 weeks, the things that had already been put in place by the 3 packages were sufficient to provide the cash flow relief to households and to firms, to small businesses especially. But as the MCO went on to the second phase, second 2 weeks and third 2 weeks, then these sort of things are beginning to look quite inadequate. So that's the nature of the problem. I'm trying to go quickly here. And then the next is to relate that to jobs. Now, jobs, Ian mentioned about, high wages jobs and so on. And we've been talking about this high productivity, higher share of income, higher share of wages for total income, better equality in terms of the polar ends of the labor market. For the longest time, we've been talking about this since, say, after 1997, 1998, but we have failed. So now, to address that problem, and then since then, since say 1995, the number of foreign workers, for example, migrants and so on, have gone from almost 0 to about 6 million today. So, and now there are no easy choices. This is what I'm going to say. There are no easy choices here. Everything that we will do, that we have to do with regard to jobs, because we're going to lose quite a bit of jobs as a result of this. But just moving forward, we won't have easy choices, because what has happened, I think this is just my thing on this thing. I repeated this elsewhere before. Unless we change what the economy does, because what the economy does change what kind of labor demand the economy wants, then the supply of labor can fit into the demand at levels of wages that make sense. If we keep on doing the same things, which is basically, plantation, oil and gas, and a lot of resource base, and some tourism, some of the services related to tourism, then that sort of economic activity doesn't create the demand that is going to pay labor enough. Now, so my third point, if you want to look at what labor reform that needs to be done, anticipating what changes ought to be, now you have to try to have a sense what the new normal would be. The new normal would be, oil and gas, which is actually a staple for Malaysia since 1970s, is at $20 per barrel is kaput, and and commodities. Because oil prices have come down, all this story about alternative energy, biogas, biofuels derived from palm oil, that story is also gone. So we are faced with what do we need to do? What can we do? How do we fit into this new normal? So I don't have a really good crystal ball, but I want to end with this new normal thing and spend some time here. Now, the new normal, and I agree with Ihan here, is actually the new normal will be about managing risk, and managing risk will have to do with managing the supply chains. And I think the last 20, 30 years, you have seen supply chains being broken up into smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller pieces. And different parts of these supply chains have been located in different parts of the world. Quite a bit of them are in China, but they are spread out. People get to be very specialized. They do things in one locality, Bangladesh, and then they do another thing in China, Malaysia, whatever, and then they put it together. Now, the disruption in the supply chain as a result of the COVID actually will force, I think, the new normal to have a little bit of a reverse globalization, which is not a total reverse, but a consolidation in supply chain. So we should look at two things that I think for jobs purposes. One is in manufacturing, and the other one is in agri-food, in food and agri-food, that we may have a chance. And related to those would be the logistics, the financial, the processing that goes with supporting both manufacturing and the agri-food. Now, there will be a slight reversal of multinationals locating too many things in China. So there will be, and plus China is no longer a cheap place. China is more expensive than Malaysia in terms of wages. So we should prepare, and we were in a good position for manufacturing. We should prepare to take on some of this relocation of businesses, global businesses, MNCs, in the process of consolidating the global supply chains. So I think manufacturing represents an opportunity which is based on foreign capital and foreign know-how, but so not really local, because we don't have much that we produce globally. But that's an important and a trend, a little mega trend that we can latch on into the new normal. But that presumes that our supply side is able to provide sort of training and capabilities that would suit these things. See, what happened in Penang, and from Penang, we had an early start, but as technology went up and manufacturing required better and better capabilities, our supply side did not really follow through. And that's why we didn't really fly off on the manufacturing side. Instead, we de-industrialized. The share of manufacturing has gone down. So we need to bring that back up in order to provide jobs. That's the first one. The second one is actually on the issue of food, agri-food. See, see, people think that we are an agricultural economy. We are not. We are a plantation economy. Our agriculture sector is quite small and underdeveloped, and we import quite a bit of food. Not just food, but related to, we import a lot of jagung and gandum because we have our poultry industry who has to import a lot of other stuff to feed as inputs into the industry. Now, the agri-food, because of food safety, it used to be just food security, but now it's also food safety, right? Because you want to be able to consume safe food. So now, I would still like to advocate that, because we have all the prerequisites in terms of weather, water, soil, and everything, that we should go back to this agri-food sector, but in a modern, in a capital-intensive sort of way, from fruits, all kinds of horticulture to aquaculture to temperate stuff, Cameron Highland stuff, right down to sea level. So this is something that we have the endowments to do. We are located in the equatorial where we can mitigate demand and production in the northern and southern hemisphere. And this also latches on into our infrastructure, our logistics, and our financial services that we can then leverage on in order to build some of these things. So that's a new normal. Those are opportunities for employment and businesses under the new normal. So I'll end with this, YB, because you are a member of parliament and Dr. Sri is a member of parliament. See, parliament should play us here. In my very short and very unsuccessful parliamentary career, Parliament should convene and discuss about laws that relates to this crisis and post-crisis, because it affects confidence of investors, right? Like any contracts, are firms and contracting parties exposed to liabilities? Are we going to have different laws to address that? If firms are not clear, they're not going to invest. Insurance ada apa? Something called force majeure, kan? Act of God, you know. MCO ni macam act of God juga lah. It affects a lot of things. So are parties liable to this sort of thing? So are workers, do companies that get this apa yang SOCSO punya employment, what do you call those things? SOCSO employment
employee retention
benefits.
Yeah.
Should we attach that they should not fire the workers while they're having that benefit? I mean, there are all kinds of legislative stuff. We were talking earlier that Parliament should look very quickly now. That's on the legislative, on the laws side, but also on the number two. It's actually, I'll end on that. It's actually the budget side. No, clearly, look, we have a 1.6 trillion economy. 1.6 trillion. 1.6 trillion, if you assume is equally divided economic activity across January sampai December, then it's about 133 billion a month. 133 billion a month. Let us say that the MCO shut down half the economy. Itu is an under calculating lah. So 2 months MCO is equivalent to 133 billion worth of production. Gone. Revenue gone, expenditure gone, production value gone. You know what that is? That is 8.3% of the economy. Now, even if MCO ends today and it starts tomorrow, there's no guarantee that people are going to spend. So actually, the effects are going to be lingering on and on. So the economy will shrink. I mean, I'm not a betting person, not minus half lah. I mean, Hafiz is trying to be minus half to Bank Negara berapa? Half to minus 2. You already lost 8.3%. So you have to do more. So hence, I think this discussion should take place in Parliament to discuss about, because the budget was passed last year for this year without taking into account all these things. So they need to actually convene Parliament quickly and talk about this thing and request for more budget and perhaps even for removing some of the fiscal ceiling that has been put in place in terms of level of debt and so on. So I'll stop there, YB, just to put some pressure on the young MP like you.
Thank you, Dr. Nosari. Actually, that goes right into our final segment before we close off. And of course, today being Labor Day, Hari Pekerja, a lot of people, the fate or future of work for themselves, is all in question. The other day, I was out in my kawasan, red zone, visiting some houses, and there was a person. The thing about the economy is that it's all numbers and figures until you see a face, right? It's all numbers and figures until you meet the person. So, 2 anecdotes. I was going door to door, and this guy, maybe in his mid-30s, says, I haven't been paid since March. I work in a big chain hotel. I don't know whether I will be paid. And he is looking after his aging mother. And of course, yesterday there was this little write-up by Kalimullah in Malay Mail online. He was in Bangsa buying some fruit, and then he met a foreign worker who's out of a job, and he's, like appealing. He's not a beggar, but he was here for work, but now he has nothing. So again, it's all facts and figures until we see these faces, right? So the question that I like to put broadly, that we have about 58 questions. Unfortunately, we won't be able to go through all. So panelists can take a look at the Q&A, and maybe, those who, deal with you specifically, maybe you can answer. But generally, are we seeing the government, in terms of what has been announced, is that enough? What more should they be doing? And anyone can start. Maybe we will just this Hafiz, or
I think I've been from the beginning a little bit unhappy about the wage subsidy, because I don't think 600 ringgit in the first place was enough. They raised it up to 100 to 1,200 for certain SMEs, but 1,200 for 2 SMEs, I think they average about 800, if even take, doesn't even cover minimum wage, right? And I think because of that, you probably wouldn't be saving a lot of jobs. I mean, so I've seen statistics saying that about 2 million workers has been covered under the wage subsidy, if I'm not mistaken. But the thing is, again, you look, I think one way to measure this is really to compare us in a month's time or 2 months' time. It might be too late, but it's an interesting exercise anyway. Compared to Singapore. Singapore is subsidizing 75% up to their median wage, and ours is not even up to the minimum wage. So what we should expect to see is that Singaporean unemployment rate probably gonna go up less than Malaysia if all things are controlled. So I think it might be a little bit too late to save a lot of jobs, but it's been a month or 6 weeks, and the response hasn't been that great in terms of jobs saving. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't do it now anyway. There's still a lot of jobs that we can save. Although we lost a lot of jobs, there's still jobs that can be saved. So going forward, I think the wage subsidy has to be increased significantly to cover at least up to minimum wage, and ideally probably up to median wage, or even twice the median wage. There's a question of government finance, but I think if the government could convince, I think a lot of limits that placed on government finance can be removed. I think it's important to understand the legal limits that government faces right now. One is the current balance. The government cannot have negative current balance for the whole year. And secondly, there's a debt limit of 55%. That can be increased easily. That doesn't need parliament per se, because that's just an appendix of that, at the back of the act that the minister can change himself. If one can convene, this limit can be removed, and we can embark on a more ambitious program to save jobs, to provide minimum level of welfare. I think that way. I think the Parliament need to proceed to allow us to give a bigger policy in place. So,
perhaps, Ihan.
Yeah, if I may, I think I agree with what Hafiz has been mentioned just now. In terms of the wage subsidy, it's definitely not enough. More needs to be done, especially towards employee retention. So, excuse me. So in any sort of, what I would caveat is that in any government help to companies with the idea of preserving jobs should operate under the condition that the jobs must be kept, or the money will not be dispersed, because you have to make sure that the idea now is to keep and retain as many employees as possible. And looking at our neighbors, Singapore, and comparing sort of situation where we have sort of similar economic conditions, we are not doing. We can do more. Yeah.
Can I add, Webby? I think Ihan gave us statistics that shows the extent of the informal sector in Malaysia, the size of the informal sector. The informal sector has to do with those being underemployed. What Hafiz showed earlier in terms of youth underemployment. Now, Now, these are we can talk about big business and whatever, all these things, but the most vulnerable people are these people who are in the informal sector. And they are not even within reach of some of these things. I mean, I've been to some of your PPRs, some of your kawasan punya PPR. You know, if you look at the PPR, the big PPRs, you know, Pantai Dalam, dekat Abdullah Hukum yang tu, 4 or 5 blocks. It's a whole economy by itself. There's a lot of interdependency in terms of this guy makes a living, he sells something, then this guy buys something. Now that whole ecosystem is actually gone, right? Because a lot of the repatriation of income from outside the PPR punya economy did not come in because they cannot work, right? And then that in turn affects the very people who makes a living from so-called repatriation of income into the PPR economy. So these are the most vulnerable people that I think we should do more for these people. So I think I again want to end on this and by saying that actually, in as far as the government needs to do, there are things that you have to do because you have to do, and then there are things that you have to do because you're doing some national planning and so on. Now, the first part is just to keep people, literally alive, and this is not the time to be considering, debt to GDP ratio. And I'm a fiscal conservative. When it comes to human life, I think this is not the time to think in terms of debt to GDP ratio, and all these things. You have to figure out. It's like you have a fire. You have to do what you have to do. Then you figure out what to do afterwards in terms of growth. Thank you.
Yeah.
If I may, I just want to sort of mention another very quick point. I think we need to look at this crisis based on the stages as it's protracted, and there's the shock, and then you have to stabilize it, you have to treat it, you have to recuperate it, and you look for ways to recover and eventually to grow. So we need to have a 3 to 6 month plans perhaps, and even review it weekly, fortnightly, because the situation is going so fast that you have to keep reviewing and make sure that the policies and the measures that are taken are relevant. The government can and should be able to step up as a last resort, providing welfare and creating the jobs and stimulate the demand. But I think ultimately we all need to be prepared to go through hardships and share what we have as a society and deal with this as a society as a whole. If I may conclude it, yeah.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Unfortunately, we're running out of time, and I think Ihan, you mentioned Parliament, and I think all the panelists and speakers, as well as even members who are watching this webinar, are asking, what about Parliament? Whether it's about changing laws or looking at efficiency of delivery of these so-called stimulus, or some people say mitigation package. MPs talk about food baskets, etc. Now, I think I'd like to return the floor to Datuk Sri Anwar, perhaps to give not only some concluding remarks, but also what are your thoughts about how we should move forward, so that this next normal or new normal doesn't just become a fad thing to say, but this is a new lived reality, and how do we proceed?
No, first, thank you, Fahmi. Thank you, the panelists. Quite illuminating, educational, and my intention, of course, both to educate my parliamentarians, not only the public. We have been doing this sort of series when I used to chair the caucus on governance in Parliament. We've got people like Jomo and Raja Rasya, quite critical of government policies, but to at least give a different dimension, viewpoint, so that we can rethink some of the standard norms. We are stuck to the old order, whatever you may say, new normal or not. Ihan talked about the protracted crisis. Nobody disputes that now. I mean, it's not going to be resolved next month or in 2 months. Even if it is resolved, as Nung Sari said, it will take time to take off. And that's why precisely we realize that this problem have somewhat exacerbated a structural crisis, a larger problem which we have inherited for decades. Now, if we look at the Sustainable Economic Development Assessment, and people looking only at the GDP figures, I'm not too impressed, although I was finance minister at that time, because you have to look at the welfare of the people. I mean, Hafiz, you mentioned it, all of you. I mean, at least the crux of the issue is the welfare of the ordinary men and women. Well, that's all about what economics is all about. And sometimes economists, ministers, Bank Negara fail to take this into account. That when we decide on a policy, what will entail and whether it will affect the livelihood and the welfare of the common rakyat. So I think, viewing the structural issue, we should then seize the opportunity to rebrand, to change what Schumpeter talks about, gale of creative destruction. This is the time, because there's new normal does not mean you make some minor adjustments, but keep the old order in place. So what do we do? And so we need to then reflect. Parliament is, of course, a major institution in this regard. Anung Sari, you said new laws. No, you have to introduce. And even these so-called packages, economic packages, these need to be debated and approved. We need the Parliament to agree that the old norm about the limits, deficit and debt ratio, it need to be revised. And there should be a national consensus on this. And this is precisely the reason why we have been saying that a debate, a vibrant discussion must take place. And prior to that, parliamentarians must take heed to the views expressed, the experts like you, those who are on the ground, the civil society, so that you actually reflect and represent these new ideas, not stuck to the old norms about who gets the contract, who gets the advantage, and who gets the opportunity to distribute to their cronies. But this persists, unfortunately. I mean, if you talk about crisis, that people are struggling and to live, to get enough food, then why do you need 72 or 70 ministers plus 3 other ministerial status? Why do you need to have politicians and MPs as a rule to hold positions in JLCs, when you know that a new norm requires us to set a new agenda to take into consideration the importance and the new direction. You highlighted on this issue of agriculture. It's true. We're talking about a new agriculture policy for decades, but other than the plantation sector, it is this agriculture is a major focus. But in agriculture, you ask them to produce, they're not attracted because you have seen them. 5 decades ago or more, Uncle Aziz talked about need for capital, low productivity, irregularities of marketing infrastructure. I memorized them. But you realize that very little has been done. You don't actually stimulate and encourage and innovate and allow people to just do it and produce. And then when they produce with all the sacrifices that you talk about, then there is a fundamental flaw in the marketing infrastructure that either get them poor returns or no return at all. That's destruction of the food crop. So I think this new normal would demand some very stringent, tough measures. I would support. I've told Prime Minister Muhyiddin, if it requires, if something that is necessary, absolutely necessary in the interest of the nation and the economy, we will support, regardless whether it is considered to be a rather unpopular policy or decision. But unfortunately, there is no awareness, the thinking. The finance ministry just talking about, saving banks. Yes, I know it's quite instrumental, to save banks, but not at the expense of the borrowers and the people. And similarly, when we talk about, I started off talking about the fundamental flaw in the issue of affecting the general workers. You talk about the increase of productivity, and the salary or the wage does not commensurate with that. And there's been studies, comparison with Korea and so many countries. We have talked about it for decades to no avail. Now, this has got to be done. Of course, at present time, you can't talk about increasing salaries. Yes, but the policy prescription must take into account of the initial flaw that we deal with it now, so that when we take off, there is going to be a new sort of standard to protect the interest of the workers, to stimulate them to work harder, and to make sure that there is better productivity. And then, of course, the issue of digitalization we talked about, which need to be pushed hard, and to create opportunities. But prior to all this, I agree with the panelists, more humane. Not always do you hear economists with such a humane outlook. Nung Sari, that's why you got into trouble. You're too humane, your views. But after all, what is politics or economic? It's about humanity. So, to my mind, the support for the people, for the workers, for the general men and women in our country has to be increased. I mean, I'm here in Segambut. I did go down. Now with the MCOs very strict, I'm more guarded. They can choose to arrest me. But when I saw, it's clearly a large disconnect from what our leaders talking about Makcik Kiah and the real men and women on the ground, struggling to have enough to eat and to protect the interests of the children. You talk online learning. There's a large disconnect between the families who's in a better position or opportunities with the general masses who have great difficulty in even following this. So I think, Ihan not fasting. So, okay. So my point is that we must take this opportunity. As you said, it's a protracted crisis which have exacerbated the whole understanding of what the flaws, fundamental flaws are. And we will have to take measures immediately, of course, to support, to even increase the assistance program to make sure that people have enough to eat. And at the same time, to formulate policies that take into account the demands, transient and the future. But there must be a coherent, consistent policy. It cannot be U-turn every other day and flip-flop. I would anticipate that after this flip-flop over Bank Negara, the Prime Minister would come, I will resolve this, back to square one. But this only reflects the incompetence of the system. And we can't afford that given the present scenario. And I think it would help immensely if you can persuade a bipartisan meeting, which I have already suggested to the Prime Minister, notwithstanding there's a backdoor government. I say, okay, we are prepared to meet, discuss in the interest of the nation, to formulate policies, at least a common policy, which would enhance our capacity in our performance. So again, thank you very much. I think we should continue these webinars, really. And I will probably in the next session would somewhat through moral suasion, all our MPs, particularly Keadilan or PH, to follow this. Because, what you have done is, of course, to provoke and provide some better understanding of the issues of the economic issues and the dictates that we require to enhance and no, I'm not necessarily to say enhance, but only to make sure that we chart a more realistic policy and not to be misled by all these figures. You know, I remember when 250 billion, it gives so much relief and satisfaction to Makcik Kia and the rest. My God. And finally, when you look at the nitty-gritty, it is not there. And now with the Bank Negara decision, it's going to be drastically less than what they announced. And asking Pakeso to pay for the workers' medical bills, which is to me outrageous. It goes to contrary to what we have planned and to protect the interests of the workers for the future. The same with the EPF funds, for example. I know I'm in that line. No, I'm still I remain conservative because most of them would have only a month savings to survive, or maximum for the private sector 2 months. And you take them. Take the funds now, they wouldn't survive when they reach the age of 60. So all these issues must be debated, must be discussed, well deliberated, and then clear, coherent policy presented to the people. So terima kasih banyak Brother Surah Fahmi. You've been very patient, and the panelists have been very, very forthcoming and helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. So thank you everyone for staying tuned. Inshallah, we will be hosting several other webinars like this, inshallah, in the near future. And to all members of Parliament, regardless of which party you belong to, I think it's, as Dr. Sri Anwar mentioned, there's a need for us to sit together, to understand the situation together, to set aside whatever petty political differences we have, and to focus on the nation, on the rakyat, on the future. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for being here. Selamat Hari Pekerja, and inshallah we will again sometime soon. Wabillahi taufiq wal hidayah. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you.
Waalaikumsalam.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.